Sometimes the most broken souls need someone who believes in second chances. In a dusty frontier settlement where survival meant everything, young Jake Mitchell made a choice that defied all reason and common sense. The dog was a legend of terror, a massive beast that had mauled 3 men and sent countless others fleeing in fear. Everyone called it a devil, a creature beyond saving. The sheriff wanted it shot. The townspeople crossed streets to avoid it. But Jake saw something different in those wild, desperate eyes. While others saw a monster, this quiet cowboy saw a wounded spirit that just needed understanding. He offered food, patience, and the one thing no one else would give, trust. But when danger finally came to their peaceful town, would this unlikely bond prove strong enough to save them all? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Cedar Ridge, painting the weathered buildings in shades of gold and amber that spoke of countless dawns, just like this one. The year was 1882, and this small frontier town, nestled in the heart of Montana Territory, had seen its share of hard times and harder men. But for all its rough edges, Cedar Ridge had something that drew good people together, a sense that neighbors looked after neighbors, even when the world seemed determined to test that bond. Jake Mitchell sat on the edge of the wooden sidewalk, outside Henley's general store, his worn boots dangling over the dusty street as he carefully mended a bridle that had seen better days. At 22, he possessed the kind of quiet confidence that came from a lifetime of honest work and a heart that his late mother had always said was too big for his own good. His hands, calloused from years of ranch work, moved with the practiced ease of someone who understood that taking care of things, whether they were horses, equipment, or people, was simply what a man did. The leather saddle sitting beside him had belonged to his father, Thomas Mitchell, who'd passed 3 winters back from a fever that Doc Patterson couldn't cure despite his best efforts. That saddle, with its hand-tooled roses and worn spots where his father's legs had rested during countless cattle drives, represented more than just equipment. It carried the weight of legacy, of values passed down through generations of men, who believed that a person's worth was measured not by what they accumulated, but by how they treated others when no one was watching. "Morning, Jake," called Doc Patterson, emerging from his small clinic with the slow gait of a man whose 70 years had been spent patching up cowpokes, delivering babies, and occasionally pulling bullets from men who'd made poor choices in saloons. His white hair caught the morning light as he paused to light his pipe, a ritual that marked the beginning of each day in Cedar Ridge. "Morning, Doc," Jake replied, looking up from his work. "That arthritis giving you trouble again?" Doc chuckled, a sound like gravel rolling down a hillside. "Son, at my age, something's always giving me trouble. But I've got remedies for most everything except old age, and even then I'm working on it." This was the rhythm of life in Cedar Ridge. Gentle conversations between people who'd known each other long enough to speak in the comfortable shorthand of familiarity. The town had grown up around the cattle trade, with ranchers bringing their herds through on the way to the railroad at Helena. What had started as a collection of tents and rough shacks had slowly evolved into something resembling civilization, complete with a proper church, a schoolhouse, and even glass windows in some of the better establishments. Sheriff Tom Bradley emerged from his office across the street, adjusting the star on his vest with the careful precision of a man who took his responsibilities seriously. At 45, he'd seen enough of life to know that trouble usually announced itself long before it arrived, if you knew how to read the signs. His weathered face bore the lines of a man who'd learned to balance justice with mercy, understanding that sometimes the law needed to bend slightly to serve the greater good. "Jake, you planning to spend the whole morning fixing that bridle, or are you going to help me with this situation we've got brewing?" Tom's voice carried the weight of authority tempered by genuine affection for the young cowboy. Jake's hands stilled on the leather, He'd been expecting this conversation, had seen it coming like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. "I reckon I know what situation you're referring to, Sheriff." The situation had a name, though most folks in Cedar Ridge preferred not to speak it aloud. They called it that dog, or the beast, or when they were feeling particularly charitable, that poor creature. But the truth was more complicated than any simple name could capture. The animal had appeared in their town 6 months ago, arriving like a plague of locusts, sudden, devastating, and seemingly without purpose beyond destruction. It was massive, easily the largest dog any of them had ever seen, with the build of a mastiff crossed with something wild and untamable. Its coat was a mottled black and brown, marked with scars that told stories of violence and hardship. But it was the eyes that haunted people's dreams. Yellow, intelligent, and filled with a rage that seemed to burn from somewhere deep in its soul. Martha Henley, who ran the saloon with an iron fist and a heart of gold, had been the first to encounter the beast. She'd stepped out to empty dishwater just as the sun was setting, and there it was, standing in the middle of Main Street like some demon summoned from the depths of hell itself. The growl that rumbled from its chest was like thunder before a storm, and when it bared its teeth, she could see that they were stained with something that might have been blood. "I've seen a lot of things in my 60 years, Martha would tell anyone who'd listen, but I ain't never seen anything that looked at me with such pure hatred. It was like that animal could see right into my soul and found it wanting." The attacks had started that very night. First, it was Billy Henderson's horse, found torn and bleeding in the corral behind the livery stable. Then old Pete Rawlings got too close while trying to shoo it away from his chickens, and the dog had lunged at him with such ferocity that it took 3 men with rifles to drive it back. Pete still carried the scars on his arm, 4 parallel lines where the beast's claws had found their mark. By the 3rd incident, when it cornered young Timothy Walsh behind the schoolhouse and nearly took his leg off before his screams brought help, the town had seen enough. They'd chained the animal to a post behind the jail, well away from the general population, and had been debating its fate ever since. "That thing's got the devil in it," declared Reverend Michaels during one particularly heated town meeting. "Some creatures are beyond redemption, beyond the reach of Christian charity. It's a danger to every soul in this community." But Jake had seen something different. Every day for the past month, he'd walked by that makeshift prison, and every day he'd noticed something that the others seemed to miss. Yes, the dog snarled and lunged at anyone who approached. Yes, it had earned its fearsome reputation through acts of violence that couldn't be ignored. But in those brief moments when it thought no one was watching, Jake had caught glimpses of something else: pain, confusion, and a loneliness that seemed to echo from its very bones. He'd started bringing scraps of food, not getting close enough to trigger an attack, but leaving them just within reach of the chain's length. At first, the dog had ignored these offerings, too proud or too angry to accept charity from the people who'd imprisoned it. But hunger was a powerful persuader, and eventually the food would disappear overnight, vanishing like morning frost under the desert sun. "Tom," Jake said finally, meeting the sheriff's gaze with the steady directness that his father had taught him was the mark of an honest man, "I know what you're thinking. I know what the whole town's thinking, but I also know something else." "What's that, son? That dog ain't evil. He's scared and hurt and angry, but he ain't evil." "There's a difference, even if most folks can't see it." Sheriff Bradley sighed, a sound that carried the weight of too many difficult decisions. "Jake, I admire your heart. I truly do. Your parents raised you right, and this town's better for having folks like you in it. But that animal has hurt people, good people, and sooner or later it's going to hurt someone real bad, maybe even kill them. I can't let that happen." "Then let me try," Jake said, the words coming out with a quiet intensity that surprised even him. "Give me a chance to work with him. If anyone can reach that dog, maybe it's someone who understands what it's like to feel abandoned and alone." The words hung in the morning air like dust motes dancing in sunbeams, visible and real, but somehow fragile enough to be swept away by the slightest breeze. Doc Patterson had paused in his pipe lighting to listen, and even Martha had emerged from her saloon to eavesdrop on the conversation that everyone knew would determine the fate of the beast that had haunted their community for so long. "Jake," Tom said slowly, "you know I respect you, but what you're suggesting is dangerous. That animal has been treated like a monster since the day he arrived," Jake interrupted, surprising himself with his boldness. "Maybe he's acting like one because that's all anyone expects from him. Maybe he just needs someone to show him there's another way to be." The sheriff studied the young cowboy for a long moment, seeing in him the same stubborn idealism that had gotten his father into trouble more than once. But Thomas Mitchell had also been one of the finest men Tom had ever known, and if his son had inherited even half of his father's character, along with his compassionate nature, maybe, just maybe, there was hope for a solution that didn't involve a bullet. "Boy," Tom said finally, "you do realize that if you're wrong about this, if that dog turns on you or anyone else in this town, it'll be your responsibility, your burden to carry." Jake nodded, understanding the full weight of what he was proposing. "I know, Sheriff, and I'm willing to accept that responsibility." As the morning sun climbed higher over Cedar Ridge, casting shorter shadows and promising another day of frontier life with all its challenges and possibilities, Jake Mitchell was already planning his first real encounter with the creature that had become legend. He didn't know then that this decision would change not only his life, but the life of every person in their small community. What he did know, with the certainty that came from somewhere deeper than logic or reason, was that every living thing deserved a chance at redemption, even the most feared dog in all of Montana Territory. The screaming started just after noon, when the sun hung directly overhead like a merciless judge presiding over the dusty streets of Cedar Ridge. Jake had been helping Doc Patterson organize medical supplies when the sound cut through the peaceful afternoon air. A man's voice raised, in terror and pain, followed by the unmistakable snarling of an animal pushed beyond all reason. Jake dropped the bottle of laudanum he'd been holding and ran toward the sound, Doc Patterson's slower footsteps following behind. What they found behind the jail made Jake's stomach turn and confirmed his worst fears about how this situation would end. Carl Brewster, a traveling merchant who'd arrived that morning to sell fabric and notions to the local women, lay sprawled in the dirt with his left arm clutched against his chest. Blood seeped through his fingers, staining his once clean white shirt a deep crimson. The beast stood at the end of its chain, muscles coiled and ready to strike again, its yellow eyes fixed on the wounded man with an intensity that spoke of barely contained violence. "Get back!" Sheriff Bradley shouted, arriving with his rifle drawn. "Everyone get back!" But the damage was already done. A blood-stained bandana lay torn in the dust, and Carl Brewster's agonized whimpers told the story more clearly than any witness testimony could. The dog had struck again, and this time the victim was a stranger to their community, someone who couldn't be dismissed as having somehow provoked the attack through familiarity or carelessness. "I was just trying to get a closer look," Brewster gasped as Doc Patterson knelt beside him, already assessing the wounds with practiced hands. "Heard tell of this famous devil dog. Thought maybe folks were exaggerating. Wasn't planning to get too close, I swear." Doc's examination revealed 4 deep gashes across the forearm, evidence of claws that had found their mark with devastating precision. "You're lucky," he told the merchant grimly. "Few inches higher, and those claws would have found your throat." "Sati!" Now a crowd had gathered. Shopkeepers and ranchers, women clutching their children close, men with their hands resting on gun handles. The mood was different than it had been during previous incidents. This time, the anger felt more focused, more determined. This time, there would be consequences. "That's enough," Martha Henley declared, her voice carrying across the crowd with the authority of someone who'd spent decades managing rowdy cowboys and drifters. "We've been patient with this situation long enough. That animal's a danger to every living soul in this town, and it's time we dealt with it permanent-like." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathering crowd. Even some of the more moderate voices, people who'd previously argued for caution, seemed ready to accept that the situation had moved beyond their ability to manage peacefully. "We need a town meeting," Sheriff Bradley announced. "Tonight, 7 o'clock at the church. Everyone's invited, everyone gets a say. But we're settling this matter once and for all." Jake watched as the crowd began to disperse, many of them casting dark looks at the chained animal that had become the center of their fears. The dog had retreated as far as its bonds would allow, pressing itself against the wooden post, with its ears flattened against its skull. But its eyes, those intelligent, tormented eyes, never stopped watching the humans who surrounded it with such obvious hatred. That evening, the small church was packed tighter than it had been since Christmas. Services. Every pew was filled with additional folk standing along the walls and crowding near the doorway. The air was thick with tension and the mingled scents of tobacco, sweat, and the lingering aromas of interrupted suppers. Reverend Michaels had agreed to let them use the church for the meeting, though he'd insisted on opening with a prayer for wisdom and Christian charity. But even his words about forgiveness and redemption seemed to fall on ears that had already made up their minds. Sheriff Bradley stood at the front of the church, his badge catching the light from the oil lamps that illuminated the space. "We all know why we're here," he began. "That dog has hurt another person today, and we need to decide what we're going to do about it." "What's to decide?" called out Ben Morrison from the back of the church. "That beast's nothing but trouble. Put it down and be done with it." A chorus of agreement rose from the crowd, but Tom Bradley raised his hand for silence. "Now hold on. I know feelings are running high, but we're going to do this proper. Everyone who wants to speak gets their turn." For the next hour, the debate raged back and forth. Some argued for immediate destruction of the animal, citing the safety of the community and their responsibility to protect innocent lives. Others suggested trying to find someone, anyone, who might be willing to take the dog away from Cedar Ridge, making it someone else's problem. "That dog's killed livestock, injured at least 4 men, and terrorized our children," argued Widow Patterson, her voice shaking with emotion. "How many more people have to suffer before we admit this creature can't be saved?" Dr. Patterson, despite sharing a last name, disagreed with the widow's assessment. "I've treated every one of those wounds," he said slowly, "and while they were serious, not one of them was fatal. If that animal truly wanted to kill, I believe it could have. Maybe there's more to this situation than we understand." But it was Martha Henley who asked the question that cut to the heart of the matter. "So what are you suggesting, Doc? That we just keep hoping and praying while that beast gets another chance to hurt someone? What happens when it's a child next time? What happens when someone doesn't get lucky like Carl Brewster did today?" The church fell silent. Even those who'd been arguing for mercy couldn't find an easy answer to that question. The weight of responsibility, the burden of protecting their community, pressed down on everyone present like a physical force. It was then that Jake Mitchell stood up. The young cowboy had been sitting quietly in the third pew, his hat in his hands, listening to every word that had been spoken. Now, as all eyes turned toward him, he felt the magnitude of what he was about. To propose settling over his shoulders like a heavy coat. "I'd like to take responsibility for the dog," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent church. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Voices rose in protest, shock, and outright disbelief. Someone, Jake couldn't tell who, shouted that he was crazy. Another voice called it suicide. Sheriff Bradley banged his rifle butt against the floor for order. "Let the boy speak!" Jake waited for the commotion to die down before continuing. "I know what you're all thinking. I know it sounds foolish and dangerous, but I also know that dog, and I think I understand what's driving him to act the way he does." "You think you understand?" Ben Morrison's voice was sharp with skepticism. Boy, that animal's a killer. Understanding don't mean much when you're bleeding in the dirt. Maybe, Jake acknowledged, but maybe there's another way. Maybe that dog's acting out of fear and pain, not pure meanness. Maybe all he needs is someone willing to show him patience and kindness instead of chains and fear. Martha Henley leaned forward in her pew. And if you're wrong, if that animal turns on you the way it turned on Carl Brewster? Jake met her gaze steadily. Then that's my choice to make and my consequence to bear. But I'm not asking the town to take any risks. I'm asking for permission to try something different before we resort to killing. The debate that followed was heated but brief. Some argued that Jake was too young, too inexperienced, too naive about the true nature of the beast he proposed to tame. Others pointed out that his heart was in the right place, even if his judgment might be questionable. In the end, it came down to a simple vote. Those in favor of giving Jake a chance to work with the dog would stand on one side of the church. Those who wanted the animal destroyed immediately would stand on the other. The count was closer than anyone had expected. 18 votes for Jake's proposal, 22 against. But Sheriff Bradley had the final word, and after a long moment of consideration, he nodded slowly. "Boy's got a right to try," Tom said finally. "But there are going to be conditions, strict ones. That dog stays chained until you can prove it's safe. Any sign of trouble, any indication that it's still dangerous, and we end this experiment immediately. And if anyone at all, gets hurt because of your decision, it's on your head." Jake nodded solemnly. "I understand, Sheriff, and I accept those terms." As the meeting broke up and people filed out of the church, many of them shaking their heads or muttering about young fools and dangerous ideas, Jake remained seated in his pew. The weight of what he'd just committed himself to was beginning to settle in, and for the first time since making his decision, he wondered if everyone else might be right about his chances of success. But then he thought about those yellow eyes, and the pain he'd seen hiding behind all that rage and fear. Tomorrow morning he would begin the most important work of his young life, proving that redemption was possible, even for the most unlikely candidates. The morning after the town meeting dawned grey and overcast, with clouds hanging low over Cedar Ridge, like a reflection of the somber mood that had settled over the community. Jake Mitchell stood outside Henley's general store, holding a simple wooden bowl that he'd carved himself from a piece of oak. It wasn't much to look at, rough around the edges and clearly the work of someone more accustomed to handling reins than woodworking tools. But it represented the first step in what he hoped would be a long journey toward understanding. The bowl would hold food, water, whatever small offerings might help bridge the gap between fear and trust. But more than that, it represented hope, the belief that even the most damaged souls could be reached through patience and genuine care. "You sure about this, son?" Doc Patterson asked, emerging from his clinic with the slow deliberation of a man whose bones had begun to remind him of his age with each passing year. "It's not too late to change your mind. Nobody would think less of you for admitting this. Might be too much to handle." Jake appreciated the older man's concern, but his mind was made up. "I'm sure, Doc. That dog needs someone to believe in him, and if I don't try, who will?" The walk to the jail felt longer than usual, with every step, taking him closer to a confrontation that would either validate his faith in redemption or prove that some creatures were indeed beyond saving. As he rounded the corner of the building, he could hear the rattle of chains and the low, menacing growl that had become the soundtrack to the beast's captivity. The dog was pressed against the wooden post, its massive frame coiled with tension, and its yellow eyes tracking Jake's approach with the focused intensity of a predator sizing up potential prey. The chain around its neck had worn a groove in the post from months of pulling and straining against the bonds that held it prisoner in this small circle of dirt and hatred. "Easy there," Jake said softly, stopping well outside the range of the chain. "I'm not here to hurt you, just brought you something to eat." The response was immediate and violent. The dog lunged forward with such force that the chain snapped taut, sending vibrations through the post that Jake could feel in his bones. The animal's lips pulled back to reveal teeth that seemed designed for tearing flesh, and the sound that emerged from its throat was less like a growl and more like the roar of some primordial beast that had wandered into the modern world by mistake. Jake's hands trembled slightly as he set the bowl of food down, but he forced himself to remain calm. This was exactly what he'd expected. The dog had learned to associate human presence with pain, confinement, and fear. It would take time to convince the animal that not all people meant harm. "I know you don't trust me," Jake continued, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "And I can't blame you for that. But I'm going to keep coming back, keep bringing you food, keep showing you that there's another way to live." He retreated to a safe distance and settled down to wait, leaning against the side of the jail with his hat pulled low over his eyes. The dog continued to snarl and pace within the confines of its chain, occasionally lunging toward the bowl of food before retreating again, as if the mere act of accepting kindness might somehow be a trap. An hour passed before the beast finally approached the bowl, and even then it did so with the suspicious caution of an animal that had learned to expect betrayal at every turn. Jake watched from the corner of his eye as the dog sniffed at the offerings, scraps of beef, fresh bread, clean water, before finally beginning to eat with the desperate hunger of something that had been surviving on whatever scraps the townspeople deemed safe to throw within chain's reach. "Well, would you look at that?" came a mocking voice from behind Jake. "The great dog tamer's got his pet eating table scraps." Jake turned to see Billy Henderson approaching, accompanied by two other young men from town. All three wore expressions of barely concealed amusement, as if they'd come specifically to witness what they assumed would be Jake's inevitable failure and humiliation. "Give him time, Billy," Jake replied evenly. "Rome wasn't built in a day." Billy laughed, a harsh sound that made the dog's head snap up from its meal. "Rome didn't have to worry about getting its throat torn out by a mad beast. How long you figure before that thing decides you're close enough to take a bite out of?" The question hung in the air, like smoke from a campfire, and Jake had to admit that he didn't have a good answer. He was operating purely on faith and instinct, guided by nothing more substantial than a feeling that the dog's aggression was driven by something deeper than simple viciousness. "Guess we'll find out," he said finally. The next few days followed a similar pattern. Jake would arrive each morning with food and water, endure the dog's violent displays of hostility, and then settle in to wait for those brief moments when the animal's guard would drop enough to allow for actual eating. Progress was measured in tiny increments, a slightly shorter time before the dog approached the food, a marginally less aggressive response to Jake's presence, fleeting moments when the growling would stop entirely. But for every small step forward, there seemed to be 2 steps back. On the 4th day, the dog managed to catch Jake off guard, lunging with such speed and ferocity that its claws raked across his left forearm before he could pull back to safety. The wounds weren't deep, but they bled freely and left 4 parallel scratches that would serve as a permanent reminder of the dangers he was courting. "Maybe that'll teach you some sense," Martha Henley observed when she saw Jake cleaning the wounds later that afternoon. "That animal's not going to change its nature just because you want it to." Word of the incident spread quickly through the small town, adding fuel to the already substantial skepticism about Jake's chances of success. People began placing informal wagers on how long it would take before the dog either seriously injured him or he finally admitted defeat and allowed them to proceed with the more permanent solution they'd originally favored. Boys got heart. Sheriff Bradley admitted to Doc Patterson over coffee one evening. But heart don't always translate to sense. I'm starting to wonder if we made the right decision letting him try this. Doc stirred his coffee thoughtfully. He's young, but he's not stupid. And his father was one of the most persistent men I ever knew. If anyone can reach that animal, it might just be Thomas Mitchell's son. Still, the doubts persisted, and Jake felt their weight with each passing day. The physical wounds healed quickly enough, but the emotional toll of facing constant failure and public skepticism was harder to bear. There were moments, usually in the quiet hours before dawn, when he wondered if everyone else might be right about the futility of his efforts. But then morning would come, and he would pick up his simple wooden bowl and walk once again toward that circle of dirt behind the jail, driven by a conviction that grew stronger with each small sign of progress. The dog was still dangerous, still unpredictable, still capable of violence that could end Jake's life in an instant. Yet something in those yellow eyes continued to speak to him, whispering that beneath all the rage and fear lay a soul that had simply forgotten how to trust. The breakthrough came on a morning when Jake least expected it, during what had started as another routine visit to the increasingly familiar patch of dirt behind the jail. He'd been working with the dog for nearly 2 weeks, and while the violent outbursts had become somewhat less frequent, the animal remained fundamentally hostile to any human presence. Jake had just settled into his usual position against the jail wall, watching as the dog approached its morning meal with the same cautious suspicion it had shown every day since their strange relationship had begun. But this time something was different. Instead of grabbing the food and retreating to the furthest extent of its chain, the massive animal paused and looked directly at Jake. For a moment, that stretched longer than any Jake had experienced in his 22 years. Man and beast regarded each other across the small space that separated them. The dog's yellow eyes, usually blazing with rage or clouded with fear, seemed to hold something else, a flicker of recognition, perhaps even the faintest shadow of curiosity. Jake had learned to carry a hand-carved wooden whistle, something his father had made for him years ago when he was learning to work cattle. The whistle could produce different tones depending on how it was held and blown, and Jake had been experimenting with using various sounds to see if the dog might respond to something other than human speech, moving very slowly so as not to trigger another aggressive response. Jake brought the whistle to his lips and produced a low, melodic tone that seemed to hang in the morning air like bird song. The dog's ears, which had been flattened against its skull in their usual position of defensive hostility, pricked forward slightly. Encouraged by this small response, Jake tried a different tone, higher this time, more questioning. The dog's head tilted to one side, and for just an instant, its expression seemed to soften from its customary mask of rage into something that looked almost like confusion, as if it were trying to remember something from a distant past. "You like music, do you?" Jake asked softly, keeping his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe someone used to play for you, back before whatever happened to make you so angry at the world." The dog took a step closer, not the aggressive lunge that Jake had come to expect, but a tentative movement that spoke of genuine curiosity rather than predatory intent. This was progress of a kind Jake hadn't dared to hope for, and he felt his heart racing with excitement and terror in equal measure. Over the next hour, Jake continued to experiment with different tones and melodies, watching as the dog gradually relaxed its defensive posture. By the time the sun had climbed high enough to burn away the morning mist, the animal was lying down in the dirt, its massive head resting on its front paws, but its eyes never leaving Jake's face. "You know," Jake said, still speaking in the gentle tones he might use with a frightened child, "you're going to need a name if we're going to be spending time together. Can't keep calling you the dog or that beast like everyone else does." He thought for a moment, considering various possibilities. The animal was clearly powerful, clearly dangerous, but there was also something noble about its bearing, a dignity that even months of captivity and mistreatment hadn't managed to break. "How about redemption?" Jake suggested. "Because that's what this is all about, isn't it? Second chances and the belief that everyone deserves a shot at being something better than their worst moment." The dog, Redemption, lifted its head at the sound of the name, and Jake could have sworn he saw something like understanding flicker in those intelligent eyes. Their quiet communion was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats and the familiar voice of Sheriff Bradley calling Jake's name. The spell was broken instantly, and Redemption retreated to the end of his chain, the defensive snarl returning to his throat as if it had never been absent. "Jake," Tom Bradley called as he dismounted from his horse. "Glad I found you. We've got trouble brewing, and I need to talk to every able-bodied man in town." Jake stood up, brushing dust from his pants. "What kind of trouble, Sheriff?" Tom's expression was grim as he approached, though he was careful to stay well clear of Redemption's reach. "Cattle thieves hit the Morrison Ranch last night and made off with nearly 30 head of prime stock. That's the third ranch they've hit in the past month, and the losses are starting to add up to serious money." The news sent a chill down Jake's spine. Cattle rustling was a hanging offense in Montana Territory, but more than that, it was a threat to the economic foundation that kept communities like Cedar Ridge alive. Without the cattle trade, their small town would wither and die like so many others that had been bypassed by progress and prosperity. "Any idea who's behind it?" Jake asked. "Strangers have been spotted in the area," Tom replied. "Rough-looking men who don't seem to have any legitimate business in these parts. Could be an organized gang working their way through all the ranches in the territory, or it could be something else entirely. Point is, we need to be ready for trouble." As they talked, Jake became aware that Redemption had stopped growling and was instead listening intently to their conversation. The dog's posture remained alert, but there was something different about the quality of his attention, less focused on potential threats and more simply listening, as if he understood that important matters were being discussed. "I'll do whatever I can to help," Jake assured the sheriff, "but I hope this doesn't mean I have to give up working with that animal?" Tom glanced at Redemption, who met his gaze without flinching. "I have to admit, Jake, he seems calmer than usual today, less murderous." Jake felt a surge of pride and hope. "He's making progress, Sheriff, real progress. I know it doesn't look like much, but something changed between us this morning. I think he's starting to trust me." Tom studied both Jake and the dog for a long moment, weighing the evidence of his own eyes against months of violent incidents and community fear. "Just be careful, son. I'd hate to lose you to your own good intentions, especially with all this other trouble brewing." After the sheriff left, Jake remained with Redemption for another hour, continuing to experiment with the whistle and noting with growing excitement that the dog's responses were becoming more consistent and less fearful. The animal even accepted food directly from Jake's hand, a first in their relationship that felt like a victory worth celebrating. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Jake prepared to leave for the day. But first, he had one more thing to try. "Redemption," he called softly, and the dog's ears immediately perked up at the sound of his name. "I'll be back tomorrow, same time. And maybe, if you keep showing me that you can be trusted, we can start working on getting you off that chain." The dog's tail, which Jake had never seen move except in aggressive displays, gave the slightest twitch. Not quite a wag, but definitely a response that spoke of something warmer than the hatred that had defined their relationship until now. Walking home through the dusty streets of Cedar Ridge, Jake felt lighter than he had in weeks. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, but for the first time since undertaking this seemingly impossible task, he had genuine reason to believe that redemption might actually be possible. 3 weeks into their daily routine, Jake arrived at the jail to find something that stopped him in his tracks. Sheriff Bradley was standing next to the post where Redemption's chain was usually attached, holding the heavy links in his hands with an expression of bewilderment and concern. "Tom?" Jake called out, quickening his pace. "What's happening? Where's Redemption?" The sheriff gestured toward the far corner of the enclosed area, where the massive dog sat calmly in the morning shade, making no attempt to escape, despite the fact that nothing now restrained him. "Chain broke sometime during the night," Tom explained. Or maybe he finally figured out how to slip his collar. Either way, he's been free as a bird since dawn, but he hasn't moved more than 10 feet from this spot. Jake felt his heart skip a beat. This was the moment he'd been working toward, but also the moment that could prove disastrously wrong about the progress they'd been making. A free redemption could be a success story or a tragedy, depending on what the dog chose to do with his newfound liberty. Has anyone else seen him like this? Jake asked. Not yet, Tom replied. But it won't be long before someone notices, and when they do, there's going to be panic. You know how this town feels about that animal. Jake approached slowly, the wooden food bowl in his hands and his father's braided rope leash draped over his shoulder. He'd been crafting the leash for weeks, working with leather and hemp in the evenings by lamplight, preparing for the day when he might be able to trust Redemption enough to walk beside him rather than strain against chains and fury. "Morning, Redemption," he said softly, settling into his usual spot against the jail wall. "I see you've had yourself quite an adventure." The dog's response was unlike anything Jake had witnessed before. Instead of the wary distance that had characterized their relationship, Redemption rose from his resting place and walked directly to Jake, stopping just an arm's length away. His massive head lowered slightly, and for the first time since their association began, his tail moved in what could unmistakably be called a wag. Jake extended his hand slowly, palm up, allowing Redemption to sniff and investigate. When the dog's wet nose touched his skin, gently, without the slightest hint of aggression, Jake felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. "Tom," he said without looking away from Redemption's face, "I think he's ready." Ready for what? To show this town what he really is underneath all that fear and anger. Sheriff Bradley's voice carried a warning tone. "Jake, just because he's calm with you doesn't mean—" "I know," Jake interrupted, "but we'll never know what he's truly capable of if we keep him locked up back here like a prisoner. He needs to see that the world isn't all chains and hatred." With movements so careful they bordered on ceremonial, Jake slipped the braided rope leash around Redemption's neck. The dog accepted it without resistance, even lowering his head to make the task easier. It was as if he understood that this represented not captivity, but partnership, a bond chosen rather than imposed. "We're going to take a walk," Jake announced, rising to his feet with the leash held loosely in his left hand. "Just down Main Street and back. Nothing dramatic, nothing threatening, just showing folks that things can be different." The first person they encountered was Mrs. Patterson, emerging from the post office with a bundle of letters clutched to her chest. Her reaction was immediate and explosive. She dropped the mail, let out a shriek that could have been heard in the next county, and scrambled backward so quickly that she nearly fell into a water trough. "It's loose!" she screamed. "The beast is loose! Someone get the sheriff!" Within seconds, the quiet morning street erupted into chaos. Shop doors slammed shut, windows were quickly shuttered, and the few people who'd been conducting early business disappeared faster than dew under a desert sun. Jake could hear voices shouting warnings, children crying, and the unmistakable sound of rifles being hastily loaded. But through it all, Redemption walked calmly at Jake's side, his attention focused straight ahead, showing no inclination toward the aggressive behavior that had earned him his fearsome reputation. When a loose chicken fluttered across their path, the dog didn't even turn his head. When a cat hissed from atop a fence post, Redemption's only response was to flick his ears once in acknowledgement before continuing forward. "Easy boy," Jake murmured, though he wasn't sure if the words were meant for Redemption or for himself. His own heart was racing as he realized how completely he'd committed himself and his companion to this public test of trust. Sheriff Bradley appeared at the far end of the street, rifle in hand but not yet raised to firing position. Behind him came Doc Patterson, Martha Henley, and what looked like half the adult population of Cedar Ridge, all maintaining a respectful distance, but clearly ready to respond if the situation turned violent. "Jake," Tom called out, his voice carefully controlled. "Everything all right?" "Everything's fine, Sheriff," Jake replied, continuing his slow progress down the street. "Redemption and I are just taking a morning walk." The use of the dog's name seemed to surprise some of the onlookers. Until that moment, most of them had thought of the animal only as the beast or that dangerous dog. Giving it a name, especially one as meaningful as redemption, suggested a level of relationship that few of them had considered possible. They completed their circuit of Main Street without incident, though Jake was acutely aware of the dozens of eyes tracking their every movement. When they finally returned to the area behind the jail, Jake half expected redemption to bolt for freedom, now that he'd had a taste of life beyond his usual constraints. Instead, the dog settled into the shade of the wooden post and looked up at Jake with what could only be described as contentment. "I'll be damned," Sheriff Bradley muttered, approaching cautiously. "He actually came back." "This is where he feels safe," Jake explained, removing the leash but leaving it coiled nearby. "He's not running because he doesn't want to run. He's choosing to stay." The crowd that had gathered began to disperse slowly, many of the townspeople casting thoughtful looks back at the dog who had just shattered their expectations about what was possible. But Jake barely noticed their departure. He was too focused on the profound change he could see in Redemption's demeanor, a peace that went deeper than simple exhaustion or resignation. For the first time since arriving in Cedar Ridge, the dog looked genuinely at ease. Their quiet celebration was interrupted by the thunderous sound of approaching hoofbeats. 3 riders came racing into town, their horses lathered with sweat and their faces grim with urgent news. "Sheriff!" the lead rider called out as he dismounted. "The rustlers hit again last night. This time, they took everything. The entire Morrison herd, plus they burned the barn and ran off the horses. They're not just stealing cattle anymore, Sheriff. They're trying to run folks off their land entirely." The news hit the gathered crowd like a physical blow. The Morrison Ranch was one of the largest operations in the area, and its destruction represented not just economic loss, but a direct challenge to the community's ability to survive and prosper. Jake felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that their small victory with redemption was about to be overshadowed by a much larger and more dangerous threat. The dog seemed to sense the change in mood, his ears perking up and his body tensing as if preparing for conflict. Something was coming to Cedar Ridge, something that would test not just Jake's faith in redemption, but the entire community's will to survive. The first sign of redemption's protective instincts emerged 2 days after the Morrison Ranch incident, during what should have been another routine morning visit. Jake had arrived to find his companion agitated in a way that was completely different from the angry hostility of their early encounters. This wasn't rage or fear, it was alertness, the focused attention of an animal that sensed danger approaching from beyond human perception. "What is it, boy?" Jake asked, settling into his usual spot, but keeping his eyes on Redemption's tense posture. The dog's massive head was turned toward the eastern edge of town, ears pricked forward and nostrils flaring as he tested the wind for scents that might explain his unease. The answer came 20 minutes later, when young Timothy Walsh came running. Down Main Street, his face flushed with exertion and fear. "Sheriff Bradley," the boy called out. "Pa says to come quick. There's strange men on horseback watching our place from the ridge line." Jake felt his blood turn cold. The Walsh Ranch was less than 3 miles from Cedar Ridge, close enough that its loss would be both economically devastating and a clear signal that the rustlers were moving closer to the heart of their community. "Sheriff." Bradley emerged from his office, already reaching for his rifle. "How many men, Timothy?" "Pa counted 5, maybe 6, the boy gasped, still trying to catch his breath. "They've been there since dawn, just watching. When he rode out to check the fence line, they disappeared back over the ridge." Jake noticed that Redemption had risen to his feet during this exchange, his attention focused entirely on the conversation, despite being too far away to hear the specific words being spoken. There was something almost uncanny about the dog's ability to sense tension and danger, as if he could read the emotional atmosphere of the entire town. "I'm riding out to investigate," Sheriff Bradley announced. "Jake, I hate to ask this, but I could use every reliable man I can get. With the rustlers getting bolder, we need to show them that Cedar Ridge isn't going to be intimidated." Jake looked at Redemption, who met his gaze with those intelligent yellow eyes that had become so familiar over the past few weeks. "What about him? Bring him along," Tom said after a moment's consideration. "If those rustlers are planning something, maybe having that beast of yours around might make them think twice about their odds." The suggestion sent ripples of shock through the small crowd that had gathered to hear Timothy's news. Martha Henley stepped forward, her face creased with concern. "Tom, are you sure about this? That dog's never been tested in a real confrontation. What if he turns on someone when the shooting starts?" Jake felt every eye turn toward him, waiting for his response to a question he wasn't entirely sure he could answer. Redemption had shown remarkable progress, but this would be asking him to function in exactly the kind of high-stress, potentially violent situation that had originally driven him to attack anything that came within reach. "He won't turn on us," Jake said with more confidence than he felt. "But if we're wrong about what he's capable of, it's better to find out now than when the town's under direct attack." 20 minutes later, a small group of mounted men rode out of Cedar Ridge toward the Walsh Ranch. Sheriff Bradley led the way, followed by Jake on his father's old horse, with Redemption loping easily alongside. Behind them came Doc Patterson, despite his age, and 3 of the younger ranchers who'd volunteered for what everyone hoped would be nothing more than a reconnaissance mission. The ride to the Walsh property took them through rolling grassland that should have been peaceful, but instead felt ominous under the weight of recent events. Jake kept one eye on the horizon and the other on Redemption, noting how the dog's behavior changed as they moved away from the familiar safety of town. The animal remained alert and focused, but there was no sign of the defensive aggression that had characterized his early days in captivity. When they reached the Walsh Ranch, they found Samuel Walsh standing on his front porch with a rifle cradled in his arms and his wife and children gathered behind him. The man's weathered face bore the expression of someone who'd spent a sleepless night, wondering if his family's livelihood was about to be stolen away. "They're gone now," Samuel reported as the group dismounted. "But they were up on that ridge for the better part of 4 hours, just watching. Counting cattle, most likely, figuring out the best way to run them off without getting caught." Sheriff Bradley pulled out a pair of field glasses and studied the ridgeline where the mysterious riders had been observed. "Any idea which direction?" "They went when they left north," Samuel replied, "toward the old mining camp. Could be they've set up some kind of base up there in the abandoned buildings." It was then that Jake noticed something that made his heart race with both pride and concern. Redemption had positioned himself between the Walsh family and the ridgeline, his massive body forming a living barrier that would have to be crossed by anyone approaching from that direction. The dog wasn't displaying any aggressive behavior, but his intent was unmistakably protective. Mrs. Walsh had noticed it too. "That's the famous devil dog?" she asked in surprise. "He's not what I expected." "He's changed," Jake explained. "Or maybe we just never gave him a chance to show us who he really was underneath all that fear and anger." They spent another hour at the Walsh Ranch, Sheriff Bradley making plans for increased patrols and discussing the possibility of organizing the ranchers into a mutual defense network. The conversation was interrupted when Redemption suddenly rose to his feet, his attention fixed on something beyond the ridgeline that none of the humans could detect. "What is it, boy?" Jake asked. But before the dog could respond in any meaningful way, the sound of distant gunfire echoed across the valley, 3 quick shots followed by a longer volley that spoke of serious trouble somewhere to the north. "That's coming from the direction of the old mining camp," Samuel Walsh observed grimly. "Could be our rustlers are having a disagreement among themselves, or could be they've run into someone else who's trying to move through their territory." Sheriff Bradley was already mounting his horse. "Either way, we need to know what's happening up there. Jake, you and that dog of yours have done enough for one day. Why don't you head back to town and let folks know we might be dealing with more than just cattle thieves?" But as Jake prepared to follow the sheriff's suggestion, Redemption made it clear that he had other plans. The dog moved to stand directly in front of Jake's horse, blocking their path back toward Cedar Ridge, while keeping his attention focused on the sounds of distant conflict. "I think he wants to help," Jake said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn on him. "I think he knows there's danger coming, and he wants to face it head-on instead of running away." Sheriff Bradley studied both Jake and Redemption for a long moment, weighing the risks against the potential benefits of having such an obviously capable animal on their side. Finally, he nodded grimly. "All right then, but if we're riding into trouble, everyone needs to understand that we're trusting our lives to a dog that 3 months ago was considered the most dangerous animal in the territory." As they prepared to ride toward the sound of gunfire, Jake felt the weight of responsibility settling over him like a heavy blanket. Everything he'd believed about Redemption's capacity for good was about to be tested under the most extreme circumstances possible. The silver star on Sheriff Bradley's vest caught the afternoon sunlight as he spurred his horse forward, and Jake couldn't help but think that Redemption had earned the right to wear a badge of his own. The abandoned mining camp sprawled across a natural shelf in the mountainside like the bones of some long-dead beast. What had once been a thriving community of gold seekers and their families now stood as weathered testimony to the fleeting nature of frontier dreams. Broken windows stared sightlessly from sagging buildings, and the main street was choked with sagebrush and tumbleweeds that spoke of years without human habitation. But someone was living there now. Smoke rose from the chimney of what had once been the camp's saloon, and fresh horse tracks in the dust told the story of recent arrivals. As Sheriff Bradley's small group approached from the cover of a rocky outcrop, they could hear voices carried on the wind, rough men discussing plans in the kind of language that left no doubt about their intentions. 5 of them, maybe 6, Tom whispered, adjusting his grip on his rifle. "Armed and probably expecting trouble." Jake crouched beside a boulder with Redemption pressed against his side, feeling the dog's muscles tense as unfamiliar scents reached his sensitive nose. For weeks, Jake had been learning to read his companion's body language, and something about Redemption's current posture suggested recognition rather than simple alertness. "Easy, boy," Jake murmured, but the dog's attention remained fixed on the camp below with an intensity that bordered on obsession. It was then that they heard the voice that changed everything. "Brutus!" The bellow echoed off the canyon walls, filled with authority and barely contained rage. "Get over here, you worthless mutt! Time to earn your keep!" The effect on Redemption was immediate and dramatic. The dog's entire body went rigid, and a whimper escaped his throat. Not the sound of fear, but something far more complex that spoke of old trauma and half-remembered pain. Jake felt his heart sink as he realized that his companion was responding to a name he'd never heard before, answering to someone whose voice clearly held power over him. "No," Jake whispered, but it was too late. Redemption was already moving down the slope toward the camp, his powerful body carrying him forward with the inevitability of a landslide. The man who emerged from the saloon was everything Jake had imagined when he'd heard stories of the most dangerous outlaws in the territory. Black Pete Morrison stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders like an ox, and hands that looked capable of breaking a man's neck without effort. His coat was torn at the shoulder, revealing a piece of fabric that Jake recognized with growing horror. It was the same material they'd found near the Walsh Ranch, evidence that this was indeed the leader of the rustlers who'd been terrorizing the region. But it was Morrison's reaction to seeing Redemption that revealed the truth Jake had never suspected. "There's my boy," the outlaw said with genuine affection, dropping to one knee as the massive dog approached. "Thought you might have gotten yourself killed running off like that. Been looking for you for months." Jake watched in stunned silence as Redemption, or Brutus apparently, allowed Morrison to scratch behind his ears with the easy familiarity of long association. Everything Jake had believed about his companion's past crumbled in that moment, replaced by a reality far more complex and disturbing than he'd ever imagined. "You were his dog," Jake said aloud, the words escaping before he could stop them. Morrison's head snapped up, his eyes scanning the rocks until they found Jake's position. Well, looks like someone's been taking care of my property while I was away." The outlaw's voice carried a dangerous edge that made Jake's blood run cold. "Appreciate that, boy? Saved me the trouble of tracking him down myself." "He's not your property anymore," Jake replied, rising from his hiding place despite Sheriff Bradley's urgent gesture to stay down. "His name is Redemption now, and he's chosen a different life." Morrison's laughter was like the sound of breaking glass. "Redemption? That's rich. You know what this animal was trained to do, boy? You know what he's capable of when I give him the right commands." Jake felt his world shifting beneath his feet as pieces of a puzzle he'd never known existed began falling into place. Redemption's scars, his violent reactions to strangers, his uncanny ability to sense danger, all of it suddenly made terrible sense. "He was your attack dog," Jake said, the words tasting like ashes in his mouth. "Best damn killer I ever trained," Morrison confirmed with pride. "Could take down a grown man in seconds, tear out a throat before his victim even knew what was happening. Worth more than all my other men combined when it came to convincing folks to cooperate with our business arrangements." Sheriff Bradley had emerged from cover now, his rifle trained on Morrison, but clearly uncertain about whether shooting would endanger Redemption or simply trigger a bloodbath. The other men in their group spread out along the ridge, taking defensive positions while trying to make sense of the rapidly deteriorating situation. "Then what happened?" Jake asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. "Why did he run away from you?" Morrison's expression darkened, and when he spoke, his voice carried the bitter resentment of someone who'd been betrayed by what he considered his most valuable possession. "Because he went soft. Had a family cornered in their cabin up near Billings, ready to do what needed doing to convince them to sell their land for a fair price. Sent Brutus in to make the point clear, the way we'd done a dozen times before." The outlaw paused, his hand still resting on Redemption's head, but his eyes fixed on some distant memory that clearly still angered him. "But there was a child in that cabin. Little girl, couldn't have been more than 7 years old. When I gave Brutus the command to attack, he looked at that kid, and something in him just broke. Instead of doing his job, he turned on my men. Put 2 of them in the ground before I could get him under control, then ran off into the wilderness like his tail was on fire." Jake felt his understanding of Redemption undergo another seismic shift. The dog hadn't been a mindless killing machine. He'd been a creature capable of choosing mercy over violence, even at the cost of abandoning the only life he'd ever known. "He chose to protect the innocent," Jake said slowly, "even when it meant giving up everything familiar to him." "He chose to be weak," Morrison corrected harshly. "But I'm a forgiving man. I'm willing to overlook his momentary lapse in judgment, especially since he seems to have found his way back to me when I needed him most." Morrison stood up, his hand moving to the whip coiled at his belt, a weapon that Jake suddenly realized had probably been used to train Redemption in the brutal arts of intimidation and violence. The dog's reaction to the sight of that whip was immediate and heartbreaking. He cringed back, his confident posture collapsing into the defensive crouch of an animal expecting punishment. "Now then," Morrison continued, his voice taking on the commanding tone of someone accustomed to absolute obedience, "let's see if you remember your training. Kill the sheriff first, then work your way through the rest of these interfering fools." The moment stretched like a taut wire, with every person present holding their breath as they waited to see whether Redemption would revert to his original nature or maintain the new identity he'd built during his time in Cedar Ridge. Jake's heart hammered against his ribs as he watched his companions struggle with conflicting impulses that must have been tearing him apart. Here was his former master, the source of food and shelter and purpose, demanding that he return to the role he'd been trained to fill. But there was also Jake, representing a different kind of life, built on trust and kindness, rather than fear and violence. When redemption finally moved, it was to place himself squarely between Morrison and the men from Cedar Ridge, his lips pulling back to reveal teeth that suddenly looked very much like weapons indeed. But the growl that rumbled from his throat was directed not at Jake and his companions, but at the man who'd once owned him body and soul. "Looks like he's made his choice," Jake said quietly, pride and terror warring in his voice as he realized that everything they'd built together was about to be tested in the most violent way imaginable. Morrison's face twisted into an expression of rage that transformed his already intimidating features into something truly terrifying. The whip came off his belt in one fluid motion, and the crack of leather against stone echoed through the canyon like a gunshot as he struck the ground mere inches from where redemption stood. "You ungrateful beast," Morrison snarled. "After everything I did for you, everything I taught you, this is how you repay me." But redemption didn't flinch this time. The dog that had once cowered at the sight of that whip now stood his ground, muscles coiled and ready for action. The transformation was so complete that Jake felt a surge of pride mixed with the cold fear of knowing that violence was now inevitable. "Brutus," Morrison tried again, his voice dropping to the hypnotic tone that had once commanded absolute obedience. "You know what happens to animals that bite the hand that feeds them. Come back to me now, and we'll forget all about this foolishness. You belong with your own kind, not with these soft-hearted farmers and their naive ideas about righteousness." For a moment, Jake feared that the psychological hold Morrison had maintained for years might still be strong enough to overcome the bonds of trust that had taken weeks to build. But redemption's response was to step closer to Jake's side, making his allegiance clear beyond any possibility of misunderstanding. The sound of rifles being cocked came from multiple directions as Morrison's men emerged from their hiding places. Among the ruined buildings, Jake counted at least 6 heavily armed outlaws, each one looking like he'd kill without hesitation if given the word. The odds were overwhelming, and everyone present knew it. "Sheriff!" Morrison called out, his tone shifting to something approaching reasonableness. "You seem like a practical man. I don't have any quarrel with your little town, and I don't particularly want to add unnecessary blood to my reputation. So here's what's going to happen." Tom Bradley kept his rifle trained on the outlaw leader, but didn't interrupt. In situations like this, sometimes the smartest thing to do was let the other man talk while you figured out your options. "I'm taking my dog back," Morrison continued, "and in exchange, my men and I will move on to more profitable territory. Your cattle will be safe, your families will sleep peacefully in their beds, and everyone gets to walk away from this with all their parts still attached." "And if we refuse?" Sheriff Bradley asked. Morrison's smile was cold as winter starlight. "Then we ride into Cedar Ridge tonight and take what we want anyway. Your choice, Sheriff. One dog, or the lives of everyone you've sworn to protect." Jake felt the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. Everything he'd worked for, every small victory in earning redemption's trust, was about to be swept away by the harsh realities of frontier justice. How could he ask an entire community to risk their lives for the sake of one animal, no matter how much that animal had come to mean to him? But before he could speak, Jake felt a gentle pressure against his leg. Redemption had moved closer, pressing his massive bulk against Jake's side in a gesture that spoke of solidarity and shared resolve. The dog's message was clear. Whatever decision Jake made, they would face the consequences together. "There's another option," Jake said, his voice carrying across the canyon with surprising steadiness. "You and your men ride out of here now, leave our territory, and never come back. In return, we won't hunt you down like the vermin you are." Morrison's laughter echoed off the canyon walls. "Boy, you've got more courage than sense, but courage don't stop bullets, and you're outnumbered. 3-1. Maybe, Jake replied, but you're forgetting something important. What's that? Jake's hand moved to rest on Redemption's head, drawing strength from the solid warmth of his companion's presence. You trained him to be a killer, but I taught him to choose who was worth protecting. And right now, he's chosen to protect people who've shown him kindness instead of serving someone who ruled through fear. The standoff stretched for another long minute, with both sides weighing their options and trying to calculate the likely cost of violence. It was Doc Patterson who finally broke the tension by stepping forward, his medical bag clutched in one gnarled hand and his ancient rifle in the other. "Pete Morrison," the old doctor said slowly, "I remember you from when you were just a kid hiding in the church during the Apache raids 20 years ago. Your mother, God rest her soul, would be ashamed to see what you've become." The personal reference hit Morrison like a physical blow, and for just an instant his confident mask slipped to reveal something that might have been pain or regret. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by renewed anger and determination. "My mother's been dead for 15 years, Morrison replied harshly. "And sentiment don't put food on the table or keep a man alive in this country. You should have learned that by now, old man." "Maybe," Doc admitted, "but some things are worth more than mere survival. That young man there has spent weeks proving that even the most damaged souls can find redemption if someone's willing to believe in them. Seems to me that's a lesson you could benefit from learning." Morrison spat in the dust. "Pretty words, Doc, but redemption don't stop bullets, and it sure don't pay for the supplies my men need to keep operating. That dog belongs to me, and I'm taking him back." It was then that Jake made the decision that would define not only his own fate, but the future of everyone he cared about. Reaching into his shirt pocket, he pulled out his mother's worn Bible, the same one she'd read to him every night during the years before her death, the same one his father had carried during their family's long journey west. "Then you'll have to go through me first," Jake said quietly, the Bible's familiar weight giving him strength, "because redemption isn't property anymore. He's family." The words seemed to trigger something in Morrison's men, because suddenly weapons were being raised on both sides, and the canyon filled with the distinctive sounds of impending violence, leather creaking, metal clicking, men breathing hard through clenched teeth. "Jake!" Sheriff Bradley said urgently, "you don't have to do this. We can work out some kind of compromise, find a way that doesn't end with good people dying." But Jake shook his head. "Some things you can't compromise on, Sheriff. Some things are worth fighting for, no matter what the cost." Redemption seemed to understand that the moment for words had passed. The dog moved to position himself between Jake and Morrison's men, his body language communicating readiness for whatever violence was about to unfold. But there was no rage in his posture now, no blind fury, just the calm determination of a creature that had chosen his side and was prepared to defend it with his life. "Sunrise tomorrow," Morrison announced, his voice carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "We'll meet you in the main street of your little town. Bring the dog, or we'll take him along with everything else we can carry. Your choice, Sheriff." The outlaw leader whistled sharply, and his men began melting back into the ruins of the mining camp, like shadows retreating before dawn. Within minutes, the canyon was empty except for Jake's group and the echo of hoofbeats disappearing into the distance. "Well," Sheriff Bradley said grimly, as they prepared for the long ride back to Cedar Ridge, "I reckon we've got ourselves a fight coming." Jake nodded, one hand still resting on Redemption's massive head. The dog had proven his loyalty beyond any reasonable doubt, but tomorrow would test that bond in ways that neither of them could fully prepare for. As they mounted their horses and began the journey home, Jake found himself thinking about his parents and the values they'd tried to instill in him during their too brief time together. His mother had always said that a person's true character was revealed not in moments of comfort and safety, but in times when doing the right thing carried the highest possible price. Tomorrow, Jake Mitchell and his unlikely companion would discover just how much their friendship was worth, and whether the bonds forged through patience and trust could prove stronger than those built on fear and violence. The setting sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson as they rode toward Cedar Ridge, and Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was seeing this familiar landscape for the last time. But beside him, redemption loped along with the easy gait of an animal at peace with his choices, and that gave Jake hope that whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together. Behind them, the abandoned mining camp settled into darkness, but the men hidden in its ruins were already making their own preparations for the confrontation that would determine the fate of everyone Jake had ever cared about. Dawn came to Cedar Ridge with the deceptive peace of countless mornings before it, painting the weathered buildings in soft gold and amber, while mockingbirds sang their complex melodies from fence posts and rooftops. But beneath this facade of normalcy, the town held its breath like a patient waiting for surgery, knowing that the next few hours would determine whether their community survived or joined the countless other settlements that had been swept away by forces beyond their control. Jake stood in the middle of Main Street with redemption at his side, both of them facing east toward the distant ridge where Morrison's gang would soon appear. The smoking Colt .45 in Jake's holster felt heavier than usual, its weight a constant reminder of the violence he hoped to avoid but knew was inevitable. He'd spent the dark hours before dawn cleaning and loading the weapon, his father's gun, carried through 3 territorial wars and passed down like a sacred trust. Behind the shuttered windows of every building, Jake could sense the presence of his neighbors. Sheriff Bradley had positioned men with rifles in strategic locations throughout the town, while the women and children had been moved to the church basement, where thick stone walls might offer some protection from stray bullets. "They're coming," Martha Henley called softly from her position behind the saloon's bat-wing doors. Her voice carried the steady calm of someone who'd lived through Apache raids and seen enough frontier violence to know how quickly situations could turn deadly. The riders appeared first as dark silhouettes against the morning sky, then gradually resolved into the distinctive figures Jake remembered from the previous day's confrontation. Morrison rode at their head, his massive frame unmistakable even at a distance, while his 5 companions spread out in a classic intimidation formation designed to make their numbers seem larger than they actually were. Redemption's ears pricked forward as the sound of hoofbeats reached them, but the dog showed none of the aggressive tension that had once characterized his responses to potential threats. Instead, he maintained the alert but controlled posture of a guardian, prepared to act if necessary, but hoping that action wouldn't be required. "Jake Mitchell," Morrison called out as the gang drew to a halt at the far end of Main Street. "I gave you all night to think about our conversation. Are you ready to be reasonable, or are we going to have to do this the hard way?" Jake stepped forward, his boots raising small clouds of dust with each deliberate pace. "We talked it over," he replied, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "The town's decision is that Redemption stays where he belongs, with people who care about him." Morrison's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. "People who care about him? Boy, that animal was bred for killing. It's in his blood, in his bones. You can dress it up with pretty names and pretend it's some kind of pet, but when the shooting starts, he'll remember what he really is." "Maybe," Jake admitted, "but I'm betting he'll remember who showed him kindness when he needed it most." The outlaw leader raised his hand, and his men began to fan out across the width of the street, a practiced maneuver that would allow them to bring overwhelming firepower to bear on any resistance. But as they moved into position, something unexpected happened. Redemption padded forward until he stood directly between Jake and Morrison's gang, then sat down in the dust with the calm dignity of a judge, taking his seat on the bench. The message was unmistakable. Anyone who wanted to reach Jake would have to go through him first. "Brutus," Morrison commanded, his voice cracking like a whip. "Come here, now!" But the dog didn't even turn his head toward his former master. Instead, Redemption's attention remained focused on the armed men who represented a threat to the community that had finally accepted him. Morrison's face darkened with rage. "Fine, if that's how you want to play it." He drew his pistol with the smooth efficiency of someone who'd killed more men than he could remember. "Boys, take them all." The first shot came from Morrison himself, aimed not at Jake, but at Redemption, an act of spite designed to eliminate the symbol of his humiliation, before dealing with the humans who dared to defy him. But Redemption was no longer the chained and helpless animal he'd once been. The dog exploded into motion with a speed that seemed impossible for something so large, darting sideways as the bullet kicked up dirt where he'd been sitting just an instant before. Jake's Colt was in his hand before he'd consciously decided to draw it, muscle memory from countless hours of practice with his father guiding his movements. His first shot took one of Morrison's men out of the saddle, the impact spinning the outlaw around before he hit the ground hard enough to raise a cloud of dust. But it was Redemption who truly turned the tide of the battle. Instead of attacking, blindly as he might have done in his violent past, the dog moved with tactical intelligence that surprised everyone present. He darted between the horses, using his size and speed to create confusion among the mounted men while carefully avoiding, putting himself in Jake's line of fire. When one of the outlaws wheeled his horse toward the saloon where Martha was positioned, Redemption intercepted the threat with precision that spoke of genuine protective instinct rather than mere aggression. The dog's leap carried him up to saddle height, and his weight combined with the horse's startled reaction sent both rider and mount crashing to the ground in a tangle of dust and cursing. Sheriff Bradley's rifle barked from the roof of his office, and another outlaw fell. Doc Patterson, despite his 70 years, proved that his hands were still steady enough to handle a weapon when necessary. The crossfire that erupted from the townspeople's prepared positions caught Morrison's men in a deadly web that their superior numbers couldn't overcome. Through it all, Redemption moved like a force of nature, protecting the innocent while avoiding unnecessary violence. When he had Morrison's men on the ground, he simply held them there rather than going for their throats. When horses threatened to trample fallen figures, he drove the animals away with strategic positioning rather than savage attacks. "He's not just fighting," Jake realized with growing amazement as he reloaded his pistol behind the cover of a water trough. "He's protecting everyone, even the men who came here to hurt us." The battle had lasted less than 10 minutes, but it had fundamentally changed everyone's understanding of what Redemption truly was beneath his fearsome exterior. This wasn't the mindless killing machine Morrison had trained, but something far more complex and worthy of respect, a creature capable of violence when necessary, but guided by principles that elevated him above the mere savagery his former master represented. As the dust settled and the sound of gunfire faded, Jake found himself facing Black Pete Morrison in the kind of showdown that frontier legends were built on. 3 of the outlaw's men lay motionless in the street, while 2 others sat with their hands raised, having discovered that surrender was preferable to the alternative. But Morrison himself remained mounted and defiant, his weapon trained not on Jake but on Redemption. 20 years I spent training that animal, Morrison snarled, his voice thick with rage and something that might have been grief. 20 years of my life poured into making him the perfect weapon. And for what? So he could turn against me for a soft-hearted boy and a town full of farmers? Jake kept his own pistol steady, but he was acutely aware that Morrison held the advantage of position and experience. The outlaw had been killing men since before Jake was old enough to understand what death meant, and his reputation for deadly accuracy was well earned throughout the territory. "Maybe that's the problem," Jake replied, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "You tried to turn him into a weapon instead of letting him be what he was meant to be. And what's that supposed to mean?" Jake glanced at Redemption, who stood ready to spring into action, but seemed to be waiting for some signal that only he could interpret. A guardian, a protector, something that chooses who to defend instead of being told who to destroy. Morrison's bitter laugh echoed off the buildings that lined Main Street. You think you know that animal better than I do. You think a few weeks of feeding him scraps makes you his master. The outlaw's thumb moved to the hammer of his pistol, and Jake knew that the final moment was approaching. Let me show you what real loyalty looks like. Brutus, Morrison commanded, his voice carrying all the authority and intimidation that had once made the dog cower in submission. Kill him. Kill them all. Remember who owns you. For a heartbeat that seemed to stretch into eternity, Redemption stood, perfectly still, caught between the conditioning of years and the newer bonds of trust and affection. Jake could see the internal struggle playing out in the dog's intelligent eyes, the conflict between ingrained obedience and chosen loyalty. Then Morrison made a critical mistake. Frustrated by Redemption's hesitation, he raised his whip, the same instrument of pain and control that had shaped the dog's violent past. The leather weapon cracked through the air, aiming not for Redemption, but for Jake, intended to force the dog to choose between protecting his new companion and obeying his former master. The decision was instantaneous and devastating. Redemption launched himself at Morrison with all the speed and power that had once made him the most feared attack animal in the territory. But now that force was directed by loyalty rather than cruelty, by love rather than fear. Morrison's horse, reared as 200 pounds of determined dog, collided with its rider, sending both man and mount stumbling backward. The outlaw tried to bring his pistol to bear, but Redemption's massive paws struck his arm with precision that spoke of intelligence rather than blind rage. The gun went flying, landing in the dust 20 feet away as Morrison found himself face to face with the creature he'd thought he owned. "Get off me, you treacherous beast!" Morrison roared, trying to reach for the knife at his belt. But Redemption simply placed one huge paw on the man's chest, pinning him to the ground with the kind of controlled force that could have crushed bones but chose merely to restrain. Jake approached slowly, his own weapon still ready, but no longer necessary. The sight of Morrison, the feared outlaw leader who terrorized the territory for years, held helpless by the dog he'd once commanded, was both satisfying and somehow deeply sad. "He's not yours anymore," Jake said quietly, looking down at the man whose broken whip lay scattered in the dust around them. "Maybe he never really was. Maybe all you ever owned was his fear, and now he's learned there are better things to be loyal to." Morrison's face was a mask of rage and humiliation, but Jake could see something else there too, a recognition that his old life of violence and intimidation was ending here in the dusty street of a town he'd thought would be easy. "Pray, this isn't over," Morrison gasped, still struggling uselessly against Redemption's restraining weight. "You think one victory makes you safe? There are others like me out there, boy. Harder men than me who won't be stopped by sentiment and a trained dog." "Maybe," Jake acknowledged, "but they'll have to deal with a town that's learned to stand together, and they'll have to face a guardian who's chosen to protect instead of destroy." Sheriff Bradley approached with a pair of iron shackles, the sound of their chains, a counterpoint to the broken leather of Morrison's whip. "Pete Morrison," he said formally, "you're under arrest for cattle rustling, destruction of property, and attempted murder. The circuit judge will be through next month to hear your case." As Morrison was hauled to his feet and led away toward the jail, his empire of fear crumbling around him like a house built on sand, Redemption padded over to Jake's side and sat down with the quiet dignity of a job well done. "Good boy," Jake said softly, his hand finding the familiar warmth of his companion's head. "Good boy." The broken whip in the dust would be swept away before evening, but its destruction represented something far more significant than the end of one man's criminal career. It marked the moment when fear gave way to trust, when violence was overcome by loyalty, and when a creature bred for destruction chose instead to become a force for protection and good. 3 months after the confrontation that changed everything, Jake Mitchell sat on the front porch of his small house on the edge of Cedar Ridge, watching the sun paint the western mountains in shades of purple and gold that never failed to remind him of his mother's favorite dress. Beside him, Redemption dozed in the afternoon warmth, his massive frame relaxed in the way that only comes to creatures who finally found their place in the world. The new leather collar around Redemption's neck bore a brass nameplate that caught the light with each breath, a gift from the townspeople that had taken Martha Henley 3 weeks to convince the territorial metalsmith to engrave. Redemption Mitchell, it read in careful script, followed by the words that meant more to Jake than any formal title ever could: Guardian of Cedar Ridge. The change in the town's attitude hadn't happened overnight. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, there had been a mixture of gratitude and lingering uncertainty. People were glad to be safe, but decades of fear weren't easily set aside. It was the small moments that had gradually shifted public opinion. Redemption gently returning a lost child to her frantic mother. The dog's protective vigil outside Doc Patterson's clinic when the old physician fell ill with pneumonia. The way he'd learned to announce his presence with a soft woof before approaching anyone on the street. Children who had once crossed to the other side of the road now competed for the privilege of scratching behind his ears. Shopkeepers saved choice scraps from their dinner tables, and even Reverend Michaels had been heard to remark that the Lord worked in mysterious ways, sometimes using the most unexpected instruments to bring about his purposes. The real transformation, Jake reflected, hadn't been in Redemption's nature. The capacity for loyalty and protection had always been there, buried beneath layers of trauma and misuse. What had changed was the dog's understanding of his own worth and the discovery that strength could be used to shelter rather than destroy. Sheriff Bradley approached from the direction of town, his badge glinting in the late afternoon sunlight. At 62, Tom had been talking more frequently about retirement, but the events of recent months had given him a renewed sense of purpose in maintaining the peace they'd all worked so hard to achieve. "Afternoon, Jake," he called out, settling into the wooden chair that had become his customary spot during these informal visits. "Beautiful evening." "That it is," Jake agreed. "Any word from Helena about Morrison's trial?" Tom nodded grimly. 20 years hard labor, assuming he lives long enough to serve it. Turns out there were warrants for him in 3 territories, and the judge wasn't inclined toward mercy. His surviving men got 10 years each, except for the one who agreed to testify against him. He'll be out in 5 if he keeps his nose clean. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching as the daily rhythm of small-town life played. Out along the dusty streets, a freight wagon rolled past, heading for the railroad at Helena, with a load of cattle from the recovered ranches. Mrs. Patterson emerged from the general store with her weekly supplies, pausing to wave at the group. On the porch, young Timothy Walsh ran by with a fishing pole over his shoulder, probably heading for the creek, where the trout were said to be biting well this time of year. "You know," Tom said eventually, "I've been thinking about what happened to us here. About what that dog of yours taught this whole community." Jake waited, knowing that the sheriff was working his way toward something important. "We spent months seeing only what we expected to see," Tom continued. "A dangerous animal that needed to be destroyed. We never stopped to consider that maybe the danger wasn't in his nature, but in how he'd been treated by the people who were supposed to care for him. People aren't so different," Jake observed. "We all become what we're expected to become. More often than not, if someone believes we're capable of good things, we tend to rise to meet that expectation. If they expect the worst from us, well," Tom nodded thoughtfully, "makes a man wonder about some of the hard cases I've locked up over the years. Maybe if they'd had someone willing to believe in them the way you believed in redemption, things might have turned out different." As if sensing that he was the subject of their conversation, Redemption opened one yellow eye and regarded the 2 men with the patient expression of a creature who'd learned to trust human judgment even when he didn't fully understand human reasoning. "The funny thing is," Jake said, scratching behind his companion's ears, "I don't think I saved him at all. I think he saved himself, and maybe saved all of us in the process. I just happened to be stubborn enough to stick around while he figured out who he really wanted to be." The evening deepened around them, bringing the first stars and the familiar sounds of a community settling into peaceful rest. In the distance, cattle lowed in pastures that were once again safe from predators, and the windows of Cedar Ridge glowed with the warm light of oil lamps and family dinners. Jake thought about his parents, gone these many years, but somehow still present in the values they'd instilled in him during their too brief time together. They would have been proud, he believed, to see what their faith in human goodness had eventually grown into. They would have understood that redemption wasn't something that could be given to another person or creature. It could only be chosen, accepted, and lived into with daily acts of courage and compassion. As the first howl of a distant coyote echoed across the valley, Redemption lifted his massive head and listened for a moment before settling back into his comfortable position. Once, that sound might have triggered memories of a wilder, more violent existence. Now it was simply part of the evening chorus that marked another peaceful day in the life they'd built together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that the bonds forged through trust and patience were stronger than those created through fear and violence. But tonight, in the gentle darkness of a Montana evening, a young cowboy and his remarkable companion could rest in the knowledge that sometimes, just sometimes, believing in the possibility of redemption was enough to make it real.